So, as a reminder, this is a live recording of the Talking About Kids podcast that we do once a month with the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health. So, in addition to our guest today, who is Anne Williford, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, we're also joined by Vinny Chulani from Phoenix Children's Hospital, one of the organizers of the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health. And we are. Do we think we're going to get Pierre Thompson at some point too? I
She
thought.
won't be here today.
Oh, she won't be here today. Okay, very good. Um, and I want to start by saying that our guest today. I was so excited about this topic. Our guest today is Dr. Anne Williford, and she is an associate professor and the PhD program director in the School of Social Work at Colorado State University. She also is, I'm going to try to get this right, so I'm going to read this, Anne. She's the director of the Healthy Schools Initiative Division at the Prevention Research Center at California State University. So I did get that right. In other words, she's one of us. But I asked her to join us today because she gave a presentation at the World Anti-Bullying Forum where she talked about colorblind racism and white fragility in the classroom. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about that. But Anne, I always like to start off by getting an understanding of the history of your interest in these concepts of colorblind racism and white fragility. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you started researching that?
Sure, yeah. I was really, I think, probably as a very young person, intrigued by oppression and marginalization and discrimination. And it really piqued my interest in exploring graduate programs that could align that personal interest and with the professional commitments of a field. And that's how I found myself to social work. And in social work, one of our core professional values is social justice. And as a practitioner, I actually worked in school settings and ran a lot of after school programs and saw a lot of bullying, which piqued my interest in that particular phenomenon. And in particular, I was really perplexed with why certain kids had such different experiences based on their identities in the education system. And that really, I give everything I can to my profession and to social work in terms of really helping me understand the history of oppression in our country, understanding how certain populations in our country have had very different experiences than our minority or majority populations. And so just always looking to understand systems of oppression and how they were created and how they're maintained and how they continue to perpetuate themselves. And so not just in the education system, although that's been the bulk of my
Hmm.
focus is looking particularly at K through 12 education, but how that might be showing up in terms of higher education. We have a lot of conversations on our campus about how things like colorblind racism and white fragility and white supremacy show up on campus. And so just I think very early on, I was very attuned to the idea of systems and the structures that maintain these oppressive forces in our society. Mhm.
I want to take a step back real quick because off the bat I started to talk about colorblind racism and white fragility. I think we need to define those terms. Can you tell me what you mean by colorblind racism?
Yeah, I think we, can certainly think about many instances, especially in our history of overt racism. And colorblind racism is really a new framing of racial ideology for kind of our modern times. And what these framings, and this is from Bonasilva's work, really profound contributions and helping us understand how racism shows up today. And essentially, what colorblind racism is racism without racists. And so it allows us to ignore race. It allows us to not see the salience of race and really structuring the experiences that people of color have in our society. And as a result, many of us might believe that we're in this post-racial society, but in fact, that's not the case. And I can, get really deep into the nuances of colorblind racism, but certainly Bonasilva's work has been really inspiring to my work And there's kind of four frames that she offers around how race might be minimized, how we might see things as people are all created equal, and that then being this kind of equalizer across race and ethnicity, which we know that that's not the case. If you look across systems, whether that's in the education system specifically, but healthcare, mental health care, child welfare, our criminal legal system, we have racial inequities in every system. And so when
Mm,
we ignore race, we do so to our detriment in terms of being able to identify where these structures continue to perpetuate these inequalities. And if we can't see race as this really determining factor in our society, then we can't often see how these structures continue to perpetuate racial inequities.
it's interesting because I think that the proponents of these policies and even laws that make the discussion of race in the classroom um, illegal. I think they're looking to achieve something else, right? The justification for these policies is that introducing race actually is harmful to the introducing the discussion of race is harmful to students. It, am I
Yeah,
getting the justification correct?
yeah, I think so. And, I kind of, and that's why, I wanted to also just kind of briefly talk about white fragility as
Hmm.
well. And, that's certainly a term that's become much more popular since D'Angelo's work in the last, 8 years. Her book came out, White Fragility, in 2016, that really helped us understand some of the defensiveness that may come up for us as white people when we try to acknowledge our racist past and, um, what role do we play in recognizing that history, and then how does that make us feel? And so oftentimes as white people we might experience defensiveness that might show up in the form of guilt and shame or anger or frustration. And what I've understood about some of these conversations that are happening across our country in terms of these policies is that we're really trying to minimize the impact, particularly on white students, in terms of
Mm,
discussing racism and our racist past, for fear of making folks feel bad about their own racial identity. But
Mm.
certainly, racial scholars, will tell you that I believe this too, the only way forward is really having to reconcile our past helps us move forward as a society. And so it's not intended, these conversations, to elicit guilt and shame. In fact, that's on us as white people to reconcile while we're having those defensive
mm,
reactions to these conversations, and instead really think about how might we be informed by our history in ways of not repeating it. And so when we ignore race, and frankly, let's I think we have to call it what it is. As white people, we are privileged in being able to ignore our race, because it's everywhere. Whiteness is truly central to the experience, of being in this particular country. And so when we ignore race, that's a privilege. And so, my colleagues, my friends, my family that are identifying as people of color can no, they can't ignore their race. It structures so
Yeah.
much of the
hmm
experiences that they have in our society. And so, just to kind of put those two together, colorblind racism, I think, is perpetuated by this white fragility and this concern that in acknowledging racism that still exists and acknowledging our racist past, somehow, we're maybe misaligning with our racial identity, especially as white people.
Yeah. And I just want to jump in. I was giving a keynote at the University of Michigan once on racism and how it impacts adolescents and adolescent health. And this is a room full of people who I know care deeply about young people, but we come to the topic of racism very differently according to our lived experiences and our intersecting identities. And I really had to begin the talk by saying we have to be able to sit with discomfort and hold emotional reactivity so that we can learn, listen, and move forward. How suspending and sitting with discomfort and suspending emotional reactivity is really a key step to moving forward.
Absolutely, Vinny. I couldn't agree with you more. And a lot of the racial equity work that we're trying to do in schools here in the state of Colorado with a colleague of mine is really trying to acknowledge that discomfort and create safe spaces for both white people and people of color to engage in these, cross-racial dialogues and these interactions that really help us understand other people's lived experiences. But when, as you were saying, when we approach that with how this discomfort might make us reactive in those situations, then we're, kind of not allowing ourselves the opportunity to really listen and learn from others, especially others who identify differently and, most likely have had different lived experiences.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me about your research is that, like, even if you are imagine that you're more concerned about the feelings of the white students in the class than you are about students who have a different experience, and you decide to kind of implement these colorblind policies. Your research is suggesting that it's even harmful for those students, those white students, when you kind of forbid the discussion of race. Can you talk a little bit about how you went about studying that and what your research found?
Sure. So the paper that I presented at the World Anti-Bullying, Brad, that you were able to hear stems from a project that we did in the Pacific Northwest, where we interviewed and held focus groups for students and staff. And this particular project really sought to understand school climate very broadly. And what we found is that one of the barriers to creating a positive school climate for students of color was this colorblind ideology that showed up in different ways. So, classroom practices like not being able to discuss race or racism, having, kind of a not fully accurate historical depiction of how our country has evolved over hundreds of years. And in particular, what the students of color what we found so striking was, despite, and I just want to acknowledge that I work with incredible educators and incredible students, and many of whom identify as white and are saying, I believe in promoting racial equity. I want to solve this problem. The schools I'm in are doing a lot around these issues. And this is, I think, one of the ways that we have so deeply internalized colorblind racism is that we literally can't see it. So the students of color in our focus groups and interviews were saying, this experience I'm having in the school is so colored by my race. Whereas within we were talking with white educators and white students who are saying, oh, everybody's treated equally. I see everybody equally. And I think that what we mean by those ideologies is that we don't want to see that somebody's different because of their race. But what that does, in essence, is then ignore how race, again, is this very salient characteristic, demographic characteristic that does color so much of a student of color's experience. And so by not acknowledging that, we are not acknowledging them. And therefore, as particularly white educators, we may not see the harm that these students are experiencing. So for example, in that project, how I got really involved is because of my expertise in bullying. And that's what we were hearing is that, students of color were saying, people are calling me the N-word because they think it's okay. And that I've given them a pass to use that term and not recognizing how harmful that is as a racial slur. This was just one example that we heard of students of color saying, this is not the school experience I'm having. And educators saying, I don't even see that happening in the hallways. They say it to themselves. So why is it a problem if a white student says it to a Black student? And so just that disconnect and that discrepancy is part of, I think, what creates a lot of harm from students. And that's what they certainly told us in this project. Now we've kind of translated some of that work into an intervention project that we've been doing here in the state of Colorado. We've worked with a couple of different community partners, a school being one of them, where we're bringing this anti-racism training that helps to, we hope, I mean, this is what our participants are telling us, helps to create a safe space to have those difficult conversations about race and racism across different racial and ethnic groups, and really look to see where racial inequities lie in that community. So in our school-based project, they were looking specifically at educational outcomes. And after that anti-racism training, we're walking them through actually a human-centered design thinking approach that really centers, it's very participatory. We as researchers are literally in the background going, y'all as community members, try to figure out what is meaningful to you and your community's experiences around racial inequities, and then how do we start to generate new innovations and new solutions. And through that process, there's this element of our intervention that, and this is specific to human-centered design thinking, that really prioritizes what's been termed empathy interviews. And we could kind of unpack whether that's the right term for those, but essentially it's talking with people to understand other people's lived experiences. And by far, that's been the most powerful piece of our participants' experiences. They've been letting us know how truly profound that was in helping them minimize that discomfort, feel okay about making mistakes or fumbling through these difficult conversations about race, and then being able to get kind of in some ways on the other side of that, so that these different groups can then start to partner think around innovations and solutions to the inequities that are showing up in their community. And I offer that in terms of, I do think there are ways forward where we can create the opportunities for that cross-racial interaction and dialogue that breaks down some of these barriers that I think are currently getting in our way in these spaces.
One of the things that because I know a little bit about the human-centered design approach, one of the things that I've seen practitioners struggle with is making everybody's perspective, or making sure that everybody in the process feels valued when they might have extremely different experiences. So, because I think one of the things that we are hearing from loud parents in school board meetings, that we're hearing from people giving testimony at state legislatures, is that we no longer value certain perspectives, that we're only, this isn't Brad's perspective, this is what I'm hearing, that we're only valuing, for example, a Black perspective, or we're only now valuing an Indigenous perspective. In your approach, how do we make sure that that's not the takeaway?
Oh gosh, Brad, that's a really great question. And thinking about some of this particular intervention work, I think again, what's been most powerful is starting with a anti-racism training, where we're really basing our work on Haro's work, that we infuse this cycle of socialization and cycle of liberation, and so that we can actually truly try to get on the other side. So the cycle of socialization pieces really help both white people and people of color kind of think about the history of our country and where we intersect with that, with these different racial identities, and how we've been kind of, programmed and pre-programmed and continually programmed to adopt these certain understandings of race and racism. And that is very colored by our own racial identity. So we do a lot of work kind of thinking about, like, how do we take our knowledge of our history and make sense of that in today's society, and see how these kind of systemic forces are still driving oppression for certain groups, and how do we sit with that in a way that and oftentimes our participants are saying, oh, I feel discomfort, I'm reacting to this, it's making me feel uncomfortable. Our white participants oftentimes are saying, that makes me feel shameful, it makes me feel upset. And our participants of color are saying, wow, that's really hard for me to reconcile this history of racism and discrimination towards people from my own racial identity. But then we equip them with these tools, and this really comes from this idea of like critical consciousness. Like, the more we understand about the world around us, the more that we can start to critically analyze, why are things the way that they are, and that's liberating. And so by infusing this kind of liberation, that like we don't just have to sit in the yuck, the discomfort, the emotional reactions that we're having, that we can actually have some tools to develop a critical consciousness to then start to rethink things. So what we're doing, for example, in these school-based iterations, is really helping create spaces for dialogue, but then also using their community's information, whether that's school-based data or different, wisdoms from their participant groups, their student feedback, the student voice, and really trying to figure out, okay, if this isn't working for a particular group, for example, in the school we were just in, they had some really pronounced racial inequities across different educational outcomes. They found that students of color were more likely to experience exclusionary discipline, so being expelled or suspended.
Yeah.
That students of color were not tracking into some of the advanced classes like white students were. So they already had a sense of like, and they were this dedicated group of people saying, we know these inequities are here, we just can't figure out what to do about it. And so that liberation then helps them think about, well, then maybe we don't have to do discipline this way. Maybe we could
Right.
actually really rethink, and adopt. And of course, restorative justice has become much more popular and common. But rethinking even that policy piece or that practice piece, and could we do things differently to try to address these inequities. So I think that's kind of part of it, is that right now the conversation is so inflamed that even mentioning race and racism
Right.
is like, oh gosh, where are we going? In fact, even preparing for this day, I got, who am I talking to, and what questions am I
Right.
going to get? These are such hot button issues. But at the same time, when we can come at it from this liberation perspective, that we don't have to sit here, we can actually move forward. We can start to deconstruct our systems so that we can reconstruct them in a way that does promote equity, that people feel excited about that. And we can move beyond some of that kind of internal stuff that we're feeling as, these conversations unfold, and really start to be more solution focused. And that seems to have, at least in our work, really helped kind of move the needle for both white participants and participants of color.
Yeah. So, Anne, I have to say, you really have to think, you're clearly viewing this as cultural change and how you affect cultural change. And but and that's the long game. As a somebody who cares for young people, you mentioned critical consciousness. I really feel that critical consciousness should be another C of youth development,
Mm-hmm.
and how cultivating critical consciousness, especially in students of color, because if performance and achievement is presented as the meritocracy that it really isn't, if young people don't see that the system is unjust and stacked against them, then the problem becomes internalized. The problem is with me and not
Absolutely.
them. And how building critical consciousness on that other end of a multi-level approach is really important, because young
Mhm.
people live up or live down to our expectations of them and their expectations of themselves.
Absolutely. And so, to think about those individual impacts, and again, our work is suggesting that these racial inequities don't just disenfranchise students of color, which we certainly know they do, but they create harm in school environments that it's
Yes.
felt by
Yeah,
everybody. And
yeah,
so when we can, Vinny, to your point, really separate the individual from the ecology, right? So the
yeah,
structures that are in place in our society, then we start to see that the problem doesn't lie within us.
yeah,
And this is, in our work, and this is both qualitative and quantitative work we've done with students of color that are telling us, when you repeatedly have these negative experiences in your school environment, you don't feel like you belong.
Right.
Why are you as invested? That maybe certain members of the school community are not going to have your back, and so why do you keep showing up in the same way? And it's hard to then not see that impacting you personally.
yeah,
But then when we
yeah,
can elevate the conversation, and this is also where my social work training comes in, because we're very much situating people in their environments and really paying attention to these kind of ecological levels and how everything interacts with everything. And so when we can situate racism where it belongs in the structures of society, then we can start to see that the solutions are then structural. And so
yeah,
that there's only so much we can expect an individual to do in an oppressive system. And that's what we've historically, I think, done to students of color, is say, well, we know that these inequities are here. We are trying to do our best to solve them. But you just got to, stand out more, work harder. It's not something that should fall on an individual's responsibility to solve a structural problem.
But I want to go back to something that you said earlier, because I worry that too many of my listeners are understand the impact that color blindness has on their students of color. But as you just mentioned, where these policies are in place, those environments, those schools, those school climates, those schools are less safe for all students, not just students of color. I want to be really clear with that these policies don't just hurt students of color, they hurt all students. And that's something that the listeners can use when they go about advocating for a better approach to discussing race than ignoring it.
Mhm.
Correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think to recognize, and it's not just when we're thinking about our young people of color, this is a, societal issue.
Right.
When we cannot recognize and start then to reconcile our past, then we can only expect to perpetuate these systems of oppression. And, there are, I think, ways to work within systems to change systems, but it starts with, I think, individual level change, right? So when we can shift attitudes, and so much of the work that we do is based on this inner group idea, right? The more that we are, because right now we live in a very segregated society. We don't like to
Mhm.
think of it that way. And a lot of times we attribute this segregation to economic issues. So I live in a particular neighborhood because I can afford to live there. And so, but when you start to look around, we really are so very segregated. But the more that we can create opportunities for cross-racial dialogue, the more that we can start to understand other people's lived experiences, and that then comes back to that critical consciousness. And then I think when we have that awareness, we can start to re-envision these systems in ways that actually can have equity at their center. Mm.
Are you getting any feedback from the white-bodied students that suggests that they are really benefiting from these processes as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've had some really incredibly diverse groups. So we've, done this a couple times in schools, but we've also done it in community with community partners. So cross-cutting different systems, not just the education system. And generally speaking, again, it's equipped. So I think it's important to acknowledge, and I know I've said this previously, but people are, I think, really wanting to not be in a racist society, that we are
Mm,
committed to equity as a goal. And yet these barriers often stem from our inability to actually talk about it and talk about where we've come from and why the structures that we have in society are the way that they are, and they're historically based. And yet at the same time, when we can talk about it, when we can minimize that kind of defensiveness, especially among our white participants, then it just creates these aha moments where people are going, I can see my own self more clearly. I can see you more clearly as somebody who's different than me. I can now see how these inequities are rooted in these systems that we need to fix. And so it changes the whole kind of orientation about and I also think going back to this idea of the system versus the individual is a lot of times our individual reactivity to these conversations is because we feel responsible or complicit or
mm,
blamed for where
mm.
we are. And what we're saying is we need to elevate that conversation to the system, and then that alleviates some of that sense of guilt or shame or responsibility
Yeah.
on us. We have a responsibility for change, but because I oftentimes kind of hear that old adage, well, I didn't own slaves, so why am
Right.
I, so it's just this whole thing of like, that's not what we're actually talking about at all. But what we're saying is our history of slavery had specific impacts on the systems we've created in the
Right.
society. And how do we start to recognize how that still shows up in terms of these racial inequities? And that's a different conversation. And I think participants can show up for those conversations
Yeah.
differently when we're kind of taking some of the onus off of them.
Well, and I think that it gets to this notion, this fear that I think too many people have that what's going to happen is that we are simply going to start to swap places inside a system that oppresses. And that's a terribly frightening concept, right? But, I can't have a discussion like this without referencing James Baldwin. What James Baldwin points out is that these conversations lead us to something better, not just, swapping out bodies inside a broken system, but to something better through a greater participation of everyone.
Mhm.
And we've run over here a little bit, and I didn't mean to have the last word there, but I do want to thank you so much for the bravery of your work and for sharing it today with the audience. Thank you so very much.
Oh,
Yes,
you're
thank
very
you.
welcome. I've appreciated being here. And, I certainly don't do it alone. I have a wonderful team of people, and I'm grateful to be in a place that's, we're working with a lot of motivated community partners to deconstruct these systems and reimagine them. And I'm excited about the work we get to do here in Colorado.
So if you've tuned into the webinar, you can know that you can go to the Talking About Kids website to get links to Anne and to her work. And if you go to the website of the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health, you can sign up and share those links so that your friends can and colleagues can participate in future monthly webinars. Anything to add, Dr. Chulani?
No, no, this was great. Thank you very much,
Okay.
Anne.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so much.
all.
Very nice to meet you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Bye bye.